Greetings everyone. Today we are on day 16 of our PMP6 exam prep step by step. Let's look at what we're going to do today. The topic today is project communications management. Let's look at it through our process management table. In our last session, we looked at the resource management and we looked at 6 processes. In fact, we covered it over 2 days and we looked at 6 processes in the project resource management knowledge area. Today, we are moving into communication management, and there are 3 processes in the communication management. If you look at it closely, we'll see that there is one process in planning process group, one in the executing process group, and one is in the monitoring and controlling process group. Now, communication management, if you look at an overview, it really ensures, it is about ensuring information needs of the project and stakeholders are met. What it really means is that we are providing the right kind of information, the right amount of information at the right time about the project and what they're looking for. To do that, we'll look at 3 processes. The first process we'll have a look at is the plan communication management. Now, plan communication management is, again, it is about developing an appropriate approach, project communication approach for the project. Then we'll move into the managed communications. Based on the plan that we have drawn, we will create, collect, distribute, store, retrieve, and dispose information. And that is what we are going to do in the managed communications process. And then finally, in the monitoring communication, what we're going to do is we want to ensure that the our stakeholders are getting the right kind of communication, and we'll monitor that we are moving according to the plan. So if you really see, there are 2 stages or 2 steps to communication management. One is drawing the strategy, how we are going to communicate, and the next is to implement the strategy in terms of what we are actually going to do and how we are going to do, and ensuring that we are doing it the right way. Now, there are a few basic concepts that we need to understand when we are talking about communication. Now, before we do that, let's talk about how important this module is, how important this communication is to managing project. Now, if you look at a project manager, the project manager is really the hub of interaction between all the stakeholders. When I say stakeholders, I mean project team, users, vendors, sponsors, management, senior management. So everyone around the project, everyone who might be impacted or will impact the project manager will be the node, communication node. All the communication will go between the, for example, between team to stakeholders. Project manager will be at the heart of it. If there is something that needs to be communicated to senior management, the project manager will be at the heart of it. So essentially, project manager will have to adapt to different types of communication. And it is said that the time a project manager spend or should spend on communication is over 90%. Now that probably tells you why or how communication is so very important. In fact, if there are failures in project, you will more often find that it is not because of the capability of the team, but it is more because of the lack of communication. If you see a project resounding success, you will find, if you dig deep, that is because there has been a very smooth communication all around in the project. So getting back to the basics, some communication mechanisms we're talking about, it can be in written form. For example, physical or electronic. It might be letter, it can be emails, or it can be spoken. The spoken can be face to face, or it can be remote, like over the phone or over video. It can be formal or informal. The way we are interacting, it might be just formal documents, even the formal language, or it might be just informally we are putting across. So it can be formal or informal. It can be through gestures. Oftentimes we don't realize how much of communication how much of communication we do through gestures, through tone or voice or facial expression. For example, when you're presenting, let's say you are presenting in front of an audience, lot of the communication goes out from what are your gestures, or what is the tone of your voice, and what are your facial expressions. Then through medias, like pictures, or some videos, action videos, there are different mechanisms that we can use. And of course, choice of words can play a big role when we are talking, we are communicating in words. Because sometimes you realize how you put across the words can be so powerful, and a succinct message, a deep message can be sent through proper use of words. So these are different communication mechanisms that is worth keeping in mind when we do communicate. Then communication dimensions. Now there are different dimensions of communication that we need to be aware of. One is, it can be internal or it can be external. Internal communications are really communications are with stakeholders within the project or within the organization. For example, our project team, or my sponsor, or maybe another department within the organization. And external are external stakeholders. They are external to the organization, maybe the vendor, maybe the government agencies. So these are external communication. Again, communication can be formal or informal. Like we said before, it can be formal meetings, we have a proper agenda and so on and so forth, or it can be informal, just an email, shoot out an email, expressing your ideas and seek ideas and so on. Then communication can be hierarchical. When we say hierarchical, it can be upward. When we say upward, it is communication with our senior management. When we say downward, it is really about communication to the project team members and of my team. And when I say horizontal, it is peer groups. For example, other project managers in the organization and so on. So communication can be hierarchical, which is it can be upward, downward, or horizontal. Then communication can be official, like annual reports that are sent out, or reports that are sent out to the government, government agency, legal, and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, communication can be unofficial. For example, when we are having general relationship building discussions with other stakeholders or the team, that is what we mean by unofficial communication. So Each of these dimension has its place. Each of these dimension we need to be aware of as project manager to be able to effectively manage the project. And again, it can be written in oral, which is, for example, verbal and non-verbal. It can be verbally communicated, it can be non-verbally, like we said, gestures, body language, or it can be media releases, and so on. Now, to be effective communicator, there are 3 points that we need to be aware, or 3 steps rather. One is, we have to have a defined purpose when we want to effectively communicate. A defined purpose. Like, we want to know exactly what we are trying to achieve through this communication. Defined purpose. And when we communicate, we need to understand the receiver's perspective. Every receiver will be different. They come with different experience, and they'll view what we are going to say differently. So we need to understand, when we understand the perspective of the receiver, our communication becomes more powerful. And when we are communicating, we need to be able to monitor its effectiveness, and measure effectiveness. So, and when we do that, we can adjust our communication based on what we understand from this monitoring and measuring its effectiveness. For example, it can be in a project. Like, when we are managing the communication in the project, and we have drawn a plan, and when we are drawing a plan, we will have a very clear understanding on what is our purpose of the particular communication. And when we are communicating, we need to be careful that we are taking into consideration stakeholders' perspective when we are doing this communication. And when we are doing that communication and when we go ahead and do it, we realize in many cases probably it is not working the way we thought it will work. And then we need to go back to our drawing board, the plan that we made, and probably change the plan to make it more effective. And then again, we apply the new plan in next round of communication and see it's effective. So in that process, what happens, our communication gets better and better as we move through the project. Now, there are some communication trends that is effective, that makes our whole communication effective. One is, when we are communicating in a project, we need to include the stakeholders in project reviews and meetings. Because the more we include the stakeholders, the more engaged stakeholders becomes. There is a buying then from the stakeholders when in our project. And the likelihood of our project being successful becomes much more when we do that. Then social communication is everywhere. And so we need to leverage on today the social computing platform that is available today and leverage that in our communication. And at the same time, we need to use or employ multifaceted approach to communication. It is not enough to be just communicating through emails, sending emails periodically. We need to send emails. We need to probably communicate at the same time through some kind of social media and so on. And then give presentation. And we have to use multifaceted approach to communication. So with that, let's start on with our first process, which is plan communications management. Now, plan communications management, the inputs that we get taken for this process are project charter, then project management plan, project documents, enterprise environmental factors, and organizational processes. The tools that we use in this particular process are quite varied, and we look at this as we go along. And then finally, what we get out as output is the main output that we'll get is the communications management plan. So communication management, when we are doing this communication management, we need to understand something about how tailored this communication should be. Now we need to understand that the way we communicate will depend on many different factors, and every project should communicate differently based on what this project is about. For example, how widespread is this geographically dispersed, or what kind of organization that is, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, we should also understand that the same type of or same method of communication is not applicable to all the stakeholders. Each of the stakeholders will have their own preferences, their own way of understanding and own technology that they can adapt to. And so we have to take care of all these different aspects when we are communicating. In other words, the communication should be very targeted at what will have the maximum impact. So some of the considerations that needs to be taken into account is who needs what information. So not necessarily all the stakeholders will need the same information, or they're looking for the same information. Who is authorized to access? Sometimes we have to ensure that we are providing basically the information only that they have access to, because in an organization typically not everyone has access to all the information. So when will they need the information? Timing is important. If we communicate too late, that might not have value at all. So when will they need the information, and when we can of course produce that information, in what format the information should be stored. Storing is an important so that it can be easily retrieved, and it can be retrieved anytime. So sometimes if we store in a way, or rather when we store, we need to remember how easy it is to take it out, and when can we take it out is at any point of time, and so on, whenever we need it. How can the store information be retrieved that we store? Is it easy to be retrieved? Can it be retrieved anytime we want? And whether time zone and cross-cultural factors matter in the communication. So all these considerations should be taken into account when we are planning the communication. Now, when we are looking at the communication, or we are doing communication requirements analysis, what kind of communication we need to do with stakeholders, there are some ways to do this analysis, and we need to look at different sources in going through this analysis, communication requirements analysis. So some of the sources are, for example, stakeholder information. Now, stakeholder information provides us information about stakeholders, and you will get it from stakeholder register and stakeholder engagement plan. That again we'll talk about in one of our subsequent knowledge areas, stakeholder management. Then potential communication channels. Now, the larger the projects, more the potential communication channels. Now, let's look at it a little more detail. We can calculate the number of communication channels. And the number of communication channels indicates the complexity of the project, communication complexity of the project. So if there are more stakeholders in the project, there are more ways this can be communicated. And it can be one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, and there are many different ways the communication can get through. So when we do that, this number or the number of communication channels tell us what is the communication complexity. So the way it is calculated is total number of channels or communication channel is n times n minus 1 by 2, where n represents number of stakeholders. Now, for example, if we have 10 stakeholders, there are 45 potential number of channels, or there are 45 ways this communication can be, there can be communication within that project. So this number of communication channels or potential communication channels tell us the complexity of the communication channel. Then the organization chart. Organization chart can also be a source on who should be communicated and how one should be communicated. Organization chart can be again a good source. And project organization and stakeholder, how the project is organized, or how different, what are the relationship there is with stakeholders, or what are the relationship between different stakeholders. This can also tell us in terms of, what kind of communication we should take. What is a development approach? If it is predictive, the way we communicate will be different if it is agile. And maybe when it is agile, it will be more, many of the stakeholders might be more immersed in the project and they might be more frequent, as opposed to when we are doing a predictive, taking a predictive development approach. What are the departments involved in the project? So that will also give an idea about, who should we communicate, how we should communicate, and how many people are involved and in what location, how are they geographically spread out. That will give us a clue on our communication strategy and what are the internal and external communication needs, meaning how many stakeholders are internal to the organization, how many stakeholders are internal to the project, and how many stakeholders are external to the organization. That will tell us how we communicate to each of those internal and external stakeholders. And if there are legal requirements, the communication, the way we communicate to address legal requirements will again be different. Now, today, there are many different communication technology. It is not like those days where probably we just had one technology, just the email probably, or just the phone. There are many different communication the technology that we can adapt. And how we do that, or what we pick to, or what we choose from those communication technologies depends on different factors. For example, urgency of need for communication. Urgency of need. If we really are very urgent, we have an urgency, we don't send an email and just wait for a response. We might either pick the phone or just go and talk face to face. This is how we'll go by when there is an urgency of need for information. Then availability and reliability of technology. Now, what technology is available at my end as a project manager? What technology is available to the stakeholder and how reliable they are? So that will also be a factor in deciding what communication technology we should adopt. Then how easy it is to be used. A technology might be reliable and available, but it might not be easy to use. And especially, we have to look at it from the stakeholder perspective. If it is not easy to use, then probably many of the communication that we'll be doing will not hit home. At the end of the day, when I am communicating with someone, my intention is, or my objective is, to ensure that the recipient understands what I'm trying to say and can probably even give me feedback on what I'm saying. But if it is not easy, the technology that I'm using is not easy for the recipient, then probably many times the recipient will not even read that email, or will not access my communication. So we have to be careful about how easy of use it is. Then project environment. Different projects will require different kind of communication technology, the environment. For example, if everyone is co-located, and we have been talking about that, then probably, there will be a lot more face-to-face communication, and some bit of it is, shared portal, or some bit of it is probably, email. But if the team or the project is dispersed geographically in different places, different team members are in different places, in that scenario, probably there will be a lot of conferencing, audio conferencing, there will be a lot of video conferencing, and there will be a lot more of the electronic communication that will take use. So it depends from project environment to project environment. And then finally, sensitivity and confidentiality of information. Many times, the communication we are, the information that we are passing along can be confidential. And if it is confidential, then we probably have to take extra steps. We might, when we are sending an email to a client with a confidential information, probably we'll have to ensure that we are spatially encrypting what we are sending, and also the client is able to easily decrypt at their end. So there cannot be any hacking to the information that we are sending. And again, if there is a proprietary information, we have to ensure that confidentiality of the proprietary information is maintained. So the choice of technology, or the choice of communication technology that we'll resort to, will depend on different factors. Then, when we communicate, there can be many different ways we can communicate. For example, sometimes we might just speak face to face, or sometimes we are just sending an email, or in many times we want to really discuss, interact. So in other words, sometimes feedback might be very important in the whole communication. And so we will discuss a communication model which takes care of all the different things that comes in the communication. And when we understand that, we can see how we want to apply this in different communication, different kinds of communication that we make. So it's communication in this model. There is a sender, as always, and there is a receiver. That's what the communication is about, right? So what happens is, this communication goes through a medium. Maybe it's over the internet and whatever, right? I mean, so it goes through a medium. Then what happens is, there is an idea, that the sender has, and the sender will encode that idea in a way that it can be communicated. We'll encode that idea and then we'll transmit that message to the receiver. Now, at the receiver end, after the receiver gets that message, and in the transmission process, there might be some noise involved, and it can be language noise, or it can be some other noise. But when it reaches the receiver again will decode this message at the receiver end. Now, receiver decodes this message and then probably will send an acknowledge message saying that, hey, I received it, got it. Now, when that happens, the sender understands that the message has been received, but not necessarily the message has been understood. Then the receiver, and in the sending acknowledge message, again there can be some noise. Now, at the receiver end, the receiver can then probably understand and have some feedback that the receiver is thinking, and that thinking that receiver has will be encoded, and the feedback message will be sent to the sender. At the sender end, the sender will decode the message to understand what the feedback message is. So essentially what we are saying, if you take an example, let's say the sender, you as a project manager, you want to express something about the scope. So you have your thoughts about some details about the scope that you understand. So you want to check with your user, let's say, end user. So what you do is, your understanding, you will encode it into an email. You will send it to email, and there might be some noise. For example, the way you worded it might create some noise. And so when it hits the at the receiver end, once they have received, the user has received that message, will just send a message, okay, I got it, I'll get back to you soon enough. And when that happens, you have got the acknowledged message. So the receiver will look through your idea, try to understand, which means will encode what you have said, and will decode what you have said, and then understand, and then will put his or her thought and encode the thought in an email, and that will be sent as a feedback message to you. Once you read the feedback message, you read through that message, what is it that the receiver is trying to say, decode it, and understand what the feedback is about. So this is the communication model. And one thing that really it brings out this model is that feedback is important. Feedback is important because, and when we communicate with our stakeholders, let's say during requirements gathering or review meetings, we should always emphasize on feedback. For example, when we discuss something, put our point of view, we want to ensure that our users are on the same page as we are, or with us. And so we probably will ask, hey, okay, so this is what I said. What is your view on this particular point? And so the user will have to think through and provide your feedback. So feedback is a key thing in our communication. Now there are different communication methods. One is what we call interactive communication. Now interactive communication is really can be multidirectional. Or rather it is multidirectional. For example, it can be two or more parties. For example, when you are going one-on-one interview, it is really between two. Interactive communication, you talk, the other person says something, and so on. Or it can be or more. You can be talking to different persons in a presentation, and they can immediately ask for clarification. And again, you can ask questions. This is also interactive communication. And for example, we are talking about phone calls, meetings, and so on and so forth. And then we have the next communication method is push communication. Now, push communication is, when you say push communication, what you mean is that we send this message directly to specific recipients. We send it out and we just push it out. But what happens in a push communication is we do not ensure receipt. Not necessarily, we are not sure if that the recipient has received that message, if the recipient has understood the message. We have no way to know that in the push communication. Some of the examples of push communications are emails or memos that we send out. So we send it out, but we are not sure that the person has received or understood that message. Then we have what is called pull communication. Pull communication is another method. The pull communication is typically used for large, complex information. For example, you want to share a large amount of data with, or maybe even the formula that you're using in deriving something that the user wanted, and you want to get that verified, or maybe the results of that. So there's a large amount of data. Now, when you want to share that, you cannot really talk it over in interactive communication. You cannot do it even by writing an email. So this is when we get into the pull communication. What you typically do is you put it in a way, maybe in a database, and the user probably will be able to access this database with that large amount of complex information in a way they can understand, they can resort to. And basically what is going to happen is recipients, in case of pull communication, will be able to access that at the discretion. They can go anytime to the database and pull up this information and have a look at what you have provided. Examples are web portal, intranet sites. You might have internet site where you are putting all the data about your project, and those data can be accessed by the users through some kind of interactive reports. And so this is a pull communication. So essentially, there are three communication methods that we're talking about. One is interactive communication, push communication, and pull communication. Then there are different forms of communication. For example, there can be interpersonal communication. This is when we are talking with the stakeholders on a direct basis, even one-to-one, or maybe small group communication. All these are in effect interactive, right? Because even a small group you might have with, for example, with your team members, your project team, you might be having discussions. So this is a small group communication. Public communication. Public communication is when you are communicating to a group of people, a bigger group of people. Probably you are giving a presentation to a group about your project. So that's really public communication. Or sometimes it is mass communication, where it is done on a very large public, a big public, and there is no interactivity at all. As an example, for example, Twitter, and if you have a lot of followers, it is really a mass communication in that sense. And then network and social computing communication. Now there are a lot of social platforms, social communication platform available today, and that can also be another way to communicate. So there are different forms of communications we need to be aware of when we are communicating, managing communication in our project. For this communication management plan is one of the output from this process, and there are different outputs that we will have. Again, I want to emphasize here that communication is one of the most important module, or one of the most important aspect in the life of a project manager, because project manager, the more a project manager communicate, the more successful that project is going to be. Ideally, or they say that a good project manager communicate around, spend 90% of the time in actual communication. So let's look at what will be there in the communication management plan that will go and implement it in subsequent processes. One is the requirements. And requirements, when you're talking about, we are talking about stakeholder communication requirements. Which stakeholder needs what kind of communication, when do they need it, what technologies we should use, and so on and so forth. Then the information. Information is what is the content that we'll be communicating, what is the language, what is the format, how much level of detail we should be communicating. Remember that not all stakeholders need same level of details. For example, someone who is working directly with the project, maybe the end user who is going to use this that you are providing, that end user might look at it in very details. But again, you might be communicating with senior management. They might not be interested in so much of details. So different stakeholders will look for different level of details. Then what is the reason for distribution? Why we are distributing some information to some stakeholders? We need to be clear on that. And what is the time frequency of distribution? Because as we have said, it has to be done at a timely manner, and when appropriate, we would seek response to ensure that the communication that we have provided has hit home. Then person group, person responsible for communication. For example, who is going to communicate what? It's not necessary that you will communicate. Maybe your team will be communicating as well. So you have to, and person responsible for authorizing release. Sometimes the communications, or rather in organization, what you'll find is all the information is not available to everyone. And especially for very restricted information, it might require some authorization before it is released. The information is released. That is for two reasons. One is sometimes because of the confidentiality, and sometimes someone needs to verify that it is correct and it is good to be distributed to the group. Then who are the persons receiving the information? So not all information will go to everyone. That is another thing that we have to put together in the plan. Then what is the method, process, allocation? What is the technology that will be used? For example, should it be mail, memos? What will be the method for updating the communication plan? And if there are issues that are not resolved, how will we go about escalating the process? And so this is, again, for example, we are communicating to get some issues resolved, and we don't hear from the recipient, then maybe it is time for us to escalate that. So what is the escalation process? We might also put together a flow chart for information flow so that it is visual and easy to understand. and what will be allocation of resource, including time and budget, because all this communication that we do will need time, will need effort, and there is, whenever there is a time and effort involved, there is a cost associated with it. So we want to also put together what will be the allocation of resource. And then if there are any constraints, sometimes there might be some constraints in terms of legislation, regulations, policies, or even technology. We might not be able to provide because of some technology constraints, or organizational policies, as you've talked about, and many other reasons. So if there are any constraints, we need to put that in the our communication management plan, so that we are communicating, we will be aware of that and ensure that we understand and take that into consideration. So next process that we'll be talking about is managed communication. Now, managed communication, what we'll do in managed communication is really about taking the plan and we'll implement it in a way that the information is provided to our stakeholders in the right way at the right time. So the inputs that we'll have here are project management plan, project documents, work performance reports. And in the tools, basically what we are trying to do here, we are trying to implement the plan that we meet. This is what managed communication is about. And the tools that we'll apply are the technology, methods, some skills, PMIs, reporting. These are all things, some of these things we talked about. And this is what we are going to implement when we are managed communication as we are executing the project. So if you remember, the plan communication management one was on planning process group, whereas managed communication is in the executing process group. So it is when we're executing the project, this is when, and we'll have to manage the communication. The output that will come out is really the communication that we are doing, the project communication, and of course in the process there will be some updates involved. Managed communication is about creating, collecting, distributing, storing, retrieving project information. This is what we'll have to be doing on a continuous basis as we are moving through the project, as we are executing the process and executing the project. And we will be doing this based on the plan that we have drawn. That is the whole idea about managed communication. And so, as you've said at the outset, the communication, essentially, there are two parts to the communication, project communications in the project. One is drawing a strategy, another is implementing the strategy. We are drawing a strategy of how will we communicate in the communication management plan, here in the managed communication, and subsequent in the controlling, monitoring communication. We are going to implement that. Make sure, and when we do that, we will have an efficient and effective communication flow between the project stakeholders. And that is really the objective here. So some techniques and consideration in managing communication is, we have talked about sender receiver models, and we will always look out for feedback loops. So, and basically, so when we communicate, we would like to understand what they are thinking. And so when we do that, that will make it more powerful, and the success of our project will go exponentially high. Then we will use the media that we'll use, for example, for communication, needs to be situation specific. If should we write? Should we speak? Or call up? Should it be formal? Should it be face-to-face? Or should I send an email? When we do that, that has to be a purpose behind why we are doing it. It has to be situation specific. Should we have a formal and informal writing style, formal writing style, or informal writing style? In some cases, formal is more appropriate. In some cases, informal is more appropriate. What kind of meeting management techniques will you use? Are we in a meeting? Are we use a very formal way? Let's say we'll have an agenda, we have a scribe, we'll have a minutes of the meeting, and follow up in the next meeting, or it is an informal meeting. Or for example, when we are having conflicts, if there is a meeting about we have a conflict, then are we what kind of techniques we are using in this particular meeting? Conflict techniques that we talked about. Presentation techniques. When we are presenting, and that will do a whole lot in our project management life. When we are presenting, is our body language conforming to the presentation that we are making? Does it conform to the visual aids that we are showing to the group during our presentation? Then when you're facilitating, again, what kind of facilitating techniques are you using in building consensus or overcoming obstacles? Then are we actively listening? So these are things that we have to keep in mind when we are managing communications from various scenarios. Some of the communication skills that will be required is the communication competence. In other words, our communication should be tailored. Tailored in the sense that when we communicate, we need to understand the perspective of the recipient. We have to understand the organization. We have to understand, we should have a cultural awareness. We should have a political awareness. All this you have to take into consideration when we are actually communicating as project manager. Feedback. We should always look for feedback. For example, if we are talking to our team members, explaining something on the team to the team members about some aspects of the project, and the team, and at certain points, we want to make sure that they are able to understand that. So feedback is a very important aspect, and we should build in feedback in our communication. Then when we are speaking, we have to be aware of our non-verbal aspects of our communication. In presentation, when we're giving a presentation, it should be clear and effective presentations, and it should meet expectations and needs, and which also means when we are going for a presentation, we have to give enough thought in the presentation, because we want to ensure that we are able to communicate correctly to the audience, and not only communicate correctly, ensure that we are providing them in a way that audience will be able to understand and even provide feedback where required. So we have to be very mindful of how we are giving the presentation. Now we will be using different information management systems. And when we are using different information management system, we have to take care or take into consideration why we are using it, because each has its own purpose. For example, we might be using electronic project management tools, which is project management software, collaboration tools, and so on. So we'll have a project management software. We might be sharing the schedule and milestones and so on. We might use that. There might be some collaborative tools that we'll be using, or there might be some electronic communication management, so email, fax, videos, website. And nowadays there is a lot of social media management systems, which is like we can apply many of the social media or management systems to a good effect for our project. For example, we can build some online communities. We can be blogging about what is happening in your project. If it may be to the internal audience, it may be to the external audience as well. So depending on from project to project. So when we're using information management system, we can use any of these different information management system. When we are managing communication, it will be, a lot of it will be as we are doing performance reporting. And the way we report our performance, do the performance reporting, and what we report, again, we have to take the communication aspect of it. For example, when you do the performance reporting, there will be often periodic collection and analysis of baseline versus actual data. That's what we talked about. Then when we do that reporting, it should be at appropriate level for each audience. Like we said before, not every audience look at the same level of details. Now, there are some basic reporting that will probably include status on scope, schedule, cost, quality, and so on, that many of the stakeholders might be interested in. But however, there might be some additional reports as well. For example, analysis of past performance or project focus may be more meaningful to sponsors. And then current status of risk and issues and work to be completed during the period, they might be the end users. For example, a summary of changes approved. And other relevant information. So there can be many different reports that come out of the project. And when we communicate, we need to be mindful of the audience. What is the kind of detail that they're looking for? What is the format that they are looking for? And so on and so forth. So we have, and performance reporting typically is a big part of communication in a project. Then we'll have the last process here in this module is monitor communication. The monitor communication, the inputs that comes into the monitor communication is the project management plan, documents, work performance data, and some of these others. And tools that we use will be data analysis, interpersonal skills, and PMIS. And really, the output will be work performance information and change request. Change request if some changes that needs to happen as we are monitoring communication. Now, monitor communication, the whole objective of monitoring communication is to provide communication, meaning the right information to the right recipients at the right time. That is really, and in other words, we want to ensure that we are communicating based on the plan that we made. And it is driven by the communication management plan, and which will ensure optimal information flow. Now, what will happen typically is, and we said that before as well, we have a plan made, and we use this plan to manage communication. As we are managing communication, we will be monitoring how we are communicating. We are monitoring its effectiveness. If you find something is not working, we are going to make changes to the plan. When we are making changes to the plan, the new plan will take effect as we are communicating next time around. So, and then we'll see if the change that we have made has its effect, or do we have to make changes. So what happens through this process, there is a continuous or continual improvement the way we are communicating to the stakeholders. And this is how we should go about in monitoring communication. And this is what we saw the change request, because when we see that some changes needs to be done, that has to go as a change request. Some of the consideration in monitoring communications are we will consult experts with knowledge of public communication and systems, because we can get tips and insights from these experts, how we want to do, what are the different ways, which one is more appropriate, and so on and so forth. We should make effective use of information management system as we capture, store, and distribute information, because there will be so much of information we'll be dealing with in the project. We cannot humanly do it without resorting to information management system. And so we should, as a project manager, make sure right at the outset that we have all these project management information system in place. Otherwise, it will be really difficult for us to manage all this communication flow. Then we will, as we are monitoring or we're planning, we will consult stakeholder engagement metrics to review changes between desired and current engagement. So we'll see in our subsequent knowledge area in the stakeholder management that when we plan or when we look at stakeholder, we try to understand where this stakeholder is in terms of how they are engaged to a project and how we want them to be. Someone might be not very supportive, and we want, for the benefit of the project, to make them supportive. And so we will plan our communication according to that stakeholder engagement strategy. So, and that's why we're saying that we have to look at the stakeholder engagement metrics to see how we have to go about communicating with the stakeholders. Engage the team. And so, again, we will have to engage the team in discussion on how to best communicate with stakeholders. Remember that it is not only we that will communicate with the stakeholders, it's also our team. And so the team should be involved as much as possible in the whole communication process to have a smooth communication flow. And we will have, we'll employ face-to-face and virtual meetings for decision making. So a lot of times, because when we have face-to-face or virtual meetings, that is when the decision making becomes more powerful instead of our email. Especially, it doesn't work out very well when we have to make some complex decisions. So with this, we finish this process, and tomorrow, and in the next class, actually tomorrow I'll not be probably taking class. I'll send out an email. So in our next class, day after tomorrow, we'll talk about project risk management. So thank you for being with me today, and I'll see you in our next class. Of course, I'll be sending the practice test as well.